El Greco's a kind of, mystic painter. And one of his early works is this Curing of the Blind Man. Jesus is having an encounter with this man, and there's this melee going on around him. To his right are all these Pharisees, and they kind of just completely miss the entire miracle. Their backs are turned to Christ. The blind man's parents are witnessing what's going on, but you can see them becoming nervous. They're worried that this is going to pull them into some conflict with the Pharisees. So some people encounter Christ saying, like, what's this really going to cost me? Kind of thing, You'll see this dark shadow between Jesus and the Pharisees. And if you read what our historians have to say about it, most of them say, well, it's unfinished work. This was probably going to be one of the helpers lifting the blind man up. And I'm thinking to myself, it goes back to like reading the gospel. There is no reference to a friend lifting him up. He's alone when Jesus encounters him. If you look very carefully, what it really is, it's an evil spirit being driven out of the man. He's being exorcised by Jesus because, of course, that's what Jesus is actually doing. I mean, he's physically curing us, but more importantly, he's spiritually curing us, right? And El Greco understood that. And I think you do have to bring eyes of faith to a painting to really understand what is going on. And the real drama of the scene is completely different if this is just another magic trick versus, my goodness, we're witnessing an exorcism here.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. My guest today, returning from a previous episode where he was here to discuss his book, The Missionary of Wall Street, is Evelyn Auth. He's been a longtime presence on the New York financial scene. He's a chief investment officer, a missionary with Regnum Christi. And today we're going to be talking about his new book, though, on a quite different topic, Pilgrimage to the Museum, Man's Search for God Through Art and Time. A book about, based on the tours that he and his wife have long been giving at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I'm very happy to have him on the show. But before we start, let me remind you that Catholic Culture and all of our podcasts are listener funded. So if you'd like to help us continue and help the website keep going, please go to catholicculture.org/donate/audio. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Thomas.
Well, I am coming up on my 10th anniversary of living in New York City in May. May 13th will be my 10th anniversary. And over that time, I have come to love the Met and try to visit it often, especially I would say since the lockdown. I've been more intentional about taking advantage of the things that the city has to offer. And I was intrigued by this book partially because it's sort of a record of someone developing a personal relationship with a particular museum over a long period of time. I mean, it's kind of unique in that way, in that it's about a specific museum and their collection for the most part. And so maybe I could just ask you to tell us about these tours that you've been giving for so long and how that all started.
Yeah, Thomas, you're kind of noting right off the bat that both of these books I've written are both kind of autobiographical in some sense. They're both about projects, missionary projects my wife and I have here in New York City. And what's interesting about the Met tour is that it really evolved and developed well before I had this reversion experience that 20 years ago brought me much closer to my faith. So we've been giving these tours to the Met almost since I got out of college 40 years ago.
Wow.
And I had a lot of art history training at Princeton, and my wife is a real lover of art and a student of it herself. And so, as you know, Tom, I mean, people come to New York, they want to go to the museum and they need a guide. And we love to take people around. And I was always giving the tour that we developed in a very kind of classical, trained fashion, clinical, I think somewhat clinical. It's probably not completely clinical, but the way an art historian would do it. And as the art historians, they kind of view themselves as some scientists of sorts. And, God they try to describe everything without mentioning the word God. And particularly at the Metropolitan Museum, if, in some ways they've been a wonderful collector and preservator of some great Christian art and a lot of other art, which is in the pilgrimage that's not overtly Christian at all. Yet their approach to it does try to be very neutral, and the result is if you've been there and see the tour groups coming around, and I've been on many of those, folks last about 45 minutes or so before the brushstrokes and the Oriental period and et cetera, just kind of their eyes glaze over.
Mm-hmm.
But no one leaves after 45 minutes because no one wants to be viewed as a bore. So they kind of hang in there. They're looking at their watch, trying to figure out how to hang in there another 45. And that's probably, our tours used to be about 45 minutes, honestly. That's about an hour. But about after I'd had this reversion experience, which I described in the Missionary of Wall Street, it didn't really affect. I still had the art in, God was still maybe in his Sunday morning box, maybe by then starting to come out of it a bit, frankly. But the art was certainly in its Met Museum box. And I was standing in front of, it's described at the very beginning of the pilgrimage, where I'm standing in front of this incredible painting by Rembrandt, which I'm sure you're familiar with, called Bathsheba, the Toilet of Bathsheba. And I'm with a Met docent, and she's very accurately describing Rembrandt's Oriental period, the fact that this is one of his only nudes, beautiful young woman, the mysterious setting. He's very interested at that time in things from the Far East, etc. So, and I'm standing there, and it finally strikes me that this painting is not about Rembrandt's Oriental period. In fact, it's not even about Bathsheba. If you look at it from the perspective of God and faith, the book, the painting is about David. Mm. And only on further inspection do you start to figure out that the painting's actually about Rembrandt. And you also begin to figure out that the image in the center of the painting isn't even Bathsheba. It's the image of Bathsheba in David's mind as he sort of takes, a priest friend always says to me, the first look is not your fault. The second look is your fault, Steve. So it's sort of that second look, or maybe the third or the fourth look. Mm-hmm. And what you're seeing is the devil toying with David as he pours this very attractive light on Bathsheba. And you're seeing David's fantasy about her almost in his mind. And what most visitors to the Met these days don't know, but all of the folks who would have seen this painting in Dutch Reformed Amsterdam in the 17th century would have seen completely was that this was the slippery slope of sin here, right? So David's in the tower, in the dark, on the upper left corner of the painting. Most people don't even notice him there, but he's there. He's in the wrong place at the wrong time. Should be up with the army up north. He starts to have these fantasies about Bathsheba. He invites her over to the palace. They have an affair. Now they've committed adultery. She's married. She gets pregnant. Everyone knows how this story goes. And then he brings back her husband from the front, Uriah, plies him with some drink, tries to get him to sleep with Bathsheba. He famously refuses, says his place is with the army. And David realizes the only way to cover it up now is to murder him. And he has Uriah murdered, basically. That you look at it that way and you start to say, well, wait a second here. There's a lot more going on here. And then from there, it wasn't really the kind of floodgates opened, and we began to look at all of the art that was on this tour of ours from a different perspective. Like, let's assume for a moment that God gives each of us a special talent. Maybe the special talent he's given these artists is the ability to describe beauty. I mean, clearly that is their special talent. And God is beauty. And if you accept the assumption that all artists, not just religious artists, are somehow seeking the image of God in their own soul, the image of beauty, and say, let's relook at everything with that assumption, which admittedly might be a leap of faith for some people to take. But I always ask my pilgrims, can you just give me this for the moment, And we go back to ancient Egypt, and we proceed 5,000 years through the entire museum on a tour that now lasts 3.5 hours. And what's fascinating about it is it becomes a gripping narrative of man's search for God over art and time, through 5,000 years. And unlike all the other tours in the Met, well, one thing, as you know, there is no tour like this in the Met, not just for content-wise, but they wouldn't even think of trying to cover the entire museum in 3.5 hours. They had 45-minute tours or an hour and a half. But the pilgrims on this tour, and I do call them pilgrims because it is tough. It is like a pilgrimage in the sense that, a lot of back staircases, a lot of walking around,
right,
a lot of high-speed walks to get from one century to the next.
Yeah.
But the narrative is so gripping. They're just like, their jaws are dropped. I mean, it's just like we get to the end and everyone's going like, is it over? What just happened?
Yeah.
And
who's attending this tour? What sorts of people?
We started out using it still use it as an evangelical tour in a way to try to bring people closer to the faith. So we've taken folks that are early in their journey of return to the faith, maybe, or maybe not even there yet. We've taken people of other faiths.
But it's advertised as a tour that has something to do with God or beauty.
No, we make sure we know folks are coming on the tour. And one of the things that they all know is that it is a Catholic tour.
Gotcha. Okay.
And they come expecting that.
Is it advertised somewhere in the Catholic world, or is there a website for it or something that?
Well, it's advertised by you could buy the pilgrimage to the museum. So here's the thing: the tour just got so popular. And it includes a dinner afterwards at a little Italian restaurant nearby. And
Nice.
we kind of unpack the tour, which is almost as important as the tour itself. So it's a huge commitment of time. It's about 6 or 7 hours.
Wow.
Nonetheless, it just started to become popular by word of mouth in New York and outside New York. We have had people fly in for the thing. And my wife and I it just became impossible for us to keep up with it. We still give 7 or 8, maybe 9 a year. So we wrote the book at the urging of many of the people who had been on the tour, and including at the urging of Sophia, who'd been involved with me in the first book because they knew about the tour. And we wrote it to try to bring the experience of the pilgrimage to more people. And nowadays, it's not completely uncommon to see people going through the pilgrimage with the book in hand. The Met, actually, if you've been in there lately, you might know that they carry the book at their bookstore, which itself, I think, is a little
Wow, that's
bit of an
great.
accomplishment.
I didn't see that. That's fantastic.
Yeah. And, well, you might not have seen it generally is.
Well, I basically never go into the gift shop, so
yeah, okay.
That's why I haven't seen
But
it.
they order a case at a time, and it kind of flies out of there. So
That's fantastic.
That's
fantastic.
Kind of fascinating to watch this whole exercise.
Let me ask you. I'm sure that you've, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming you've probably been to a number of the world's great art museums. And what do you think makes the Met special, and where does it rank among the great art museums of the Western world?
Okay, number one, I'm clearly biased. I mean, I grew up in the metro area.
Right.
And so I have an affinity to the Met, and I do deeply appreciate, as much as they annoy me at times with some of the ways they describe the art.
Yeah, totally. I agree. Yeah.
On the other hand, I have a deep gratitude to them for having collected such a broad collection, and for having brought some paintings to New York that are literally priceless. There's a painting in the museum, and it's in the about the first third of the tour. I call it the Emmanuel moment in art, really the moment that artists begin to bring God to earth in a way, literally painting him in the nativity scenes, but more importantly, painting him as a man human as opposed to simply an abstract figure in the distance. It's sort of a fulcrum point of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. The painting the Met has that really shows that is a painting by Duccio in 1300 called The Madonna and Child. In some ways, it looks like other iconic Madonna and Child images we would have seen at that point in the tour. But then I point out to people some things that are very unusual. Like, for one, there's a balustrade at the bottom of the painting. So up until that point, the icons didn't need a balustrade because they're an image in heaven.
Right.
But he's putting on a balustrade, so we're now looking through an inn in Bethlehem. And then you see the figures are not two-dimensional abstract, but they're actually got some shading to them, so they're actually here on earth. And then importantly, Duccio, up to now, you would have seen images of Mary pondering the future, keeping these things in her heart in a kind of iconographic way, symbolically, if you will. But Duccio paints what's inside her head. You see this really human look of concern, but strength and perseverance in her face. And you see the baby Jesus in this, I call it the Emmanuel moment, reaching up and comforting his mother.
Right.
And I'm not sure if you're familiar with this painting, Thomas. It's a little tiny painting by Duccio. It's only 8 by 10. And the director of the Met, Piero de Montebello, who served for 30 years, he went over, I think it was to Italy, to Sotheby's in the early 1990s. And it was about to go on auction. He knew the Louvre was after it. But of course, the French are forming a task force and trying to figure out what it would be worth. And Montebello knows that this is the last Duccio in private hands, period.
Wow.
And a seminal work. And he gives a preemptory bid to Sotheby's, $45 million. I mean, completely way out of league with what they were going to ask for it.
Wow.
And New York was scandalized. This crazy director just wasted $45 million on this little tiny painting, but it's one of the great masterpieces. So there's a lot of paintings like that at the Met. And to answer your question, my wife complains I sometimes interrupt myself too many times, but it is. It's got to be the Met. I mean, maybe it could be the Louvre. But what's interesting about the Met to me is it was developed much more quickly than these other museums and less by accident. And a lot of them were based on the accident of their founding. Like some king was collecting everything and then it was his private collection was made in, like the Louvre as an example. But in the case of the Met, New York got really rich in the Industrial Revolution. And the rich families of New York got together and said, we need a museum. And they purposely went out to create an encyclopedic museum.
Right. Yes.
And that's what makes, because people have asked me, could we design this in our city? And I've looked at the National Gallery, I think maybe the Louvre, maybe Chicago Art Institute, but there's nothing like the Met. I mean, it has a really encyclopedic collection. And one of the things that's really powerful about it, I mean, Liz Lev, who you may know.
Yes. No, she's been on several times. Yeah.
In Rome. And she's on the list to take the tour, actually. But, and she put in a very nice review of the pilgrimage, by the way. It's on
I saw that. Yeah.
Cover. But Liz, I think she sees in this what's so powerful is that you can do this in one place.
Right.
And look at the history of art through a completely different lens, the lens of truth, actually, and beauty. And this is what most people, I want to say everybody, and it's probably true, but I don't want to sound like I'm exaggerating, but what people say to me is, this is the first art tour, the first art book they've read that made any sense. And you can go through the entire history of art and you see things coming together and motifs recurring. And you see a structure. I was interviewed for the book early on by someone who's not a believer and told me that, he's an atheist. But he said, Steve, I really liked your book and I really like to interview you if it's okay. And we had this interview. And his first question was, he's a writer and it's on a, book podcast. And he said, Steve, I want to start out with how did you develop the structure of this book? I mean, it is really almost written like a novel. It has this sort of natural beginning and kind of complex interplay in the middle, and then it kind of grows to a crescendo, and then there's a climax. And he goes, how did you come up with this? It's just really brilliant. And I said, well, I don't want to disappoint you with the answer because I know what you want me to say, but honestly, I didn't come up with it. It was there. I just unlocked it. God came up with it. In fact, that's the way I conclude the book. In the epilogue, that maybe it's not man's search for God. Maybe it should have been, the subtitle should have been God's search for man. Right.
So there's many of the world's great museums I've not yet been to. I haven't visited France or England yet, but if I had to pick one for my favorite in terms of what percentage of the art is specifically to my taste, I'd probably say the Prado, because I love the sheer concentration of great Spanish and Dutch depictions of the Passion are very much to my taste. But the Met, like you said, they have so much from every culture and every period that, especially if you include the cloisters uptown, which is where a lot of the medieval art is kept, that you really can get a comprehensive art education. And that's what I've been trying to do. Like a couple of years ago, I decided I wanted to go through the entire museum room by room in numerical order very slowly and just give myself an art education. And my original idea was I'm gonna spend at least 5 minutes looking at each object, and then I quickly realized that's absolutely insane. After I had looked at my 8th flint tool from ancient Egypt, I was like, okay, I know what flint looks like now. I don't need to spend 5 minutes looking at each of these. But I'm still I'm in ancient Greece. I'm getting towards the end of ancient Greece and Rome right now.
Keep going.
Yeah. So I had to be more intentional about it. And one reason for that is that I find it's very easy to visit a museum and just sort of wander around and half look at things, especially if you're with friends.
Yeah.
My experience is I really have to go alone. And one thing that I was really interested in talking to you about is there is an art to visiting a museum. And so, a lot of people will read your book and enjoy it. They might not be able to visit the Met easily themselves. They might live in the DC area, though. They might be able to go to the National Gallery, for instance, or they might have a smaller scale, some kind of local town museum or something. And I'm interested in what's the best way to get something out of whatever museum you have access to. What's the best way to visit? Like I find I go because I have easy access to it living in Manhattan. It's walkable. I go to St. Vincent Ferrer. It's walkable from my parish. I usually go in for 45 minutes and then I stop because my eyes are about to fall out of my head from looking at all these, Greek vases. But what do you think? What tips would you give people for, getting the most out of their museum visits and doing it in kind of an intentional way? And not that wandering around isn't also productive in its own way.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the big problems that people have in museums. They're not intentional. I mean, it's hard to be intentional. You don't know what you're looking for necessarily. Mm-hmm. So the one thing I would do is which is the opposite of what we do in the pilgrimage in some ways, because you really need a skilled guide with you to do the pilgrimage the way that we do it.
Right.
I think what you should do, in my estimation, is concentrate on half a dozen works and do a little research ahead of time what half a dozen you're looking for. If you read the pilgrimage, you'll see, Thomas, you might have recognized a pattern. I mean, as everything else I write, it's very non-didactic, non-scholarly. It's more experiential. But in the experience, there's a formula that you'll begin to see we use to try to unlock what's going on here. And the formula is not applied in a kind of symmetric, scientific fashion. But roughly speaking, for me, to really understand a painting at great depth, the first thing you need to do is to understand the context of the time. What's going on at the time in the history of the time, the culture, and in the artist's own life. And that takes a little bit of research, but you could do that in advance. This is very different than the way a lot of cultural projects today work. I mean, people insist on transporting what's going on in our time to interpreting stuff being painted, 500 years ago. But I would start with the context. And then the second is to do a little work from an art history book about the art itself and some of the symbolism in it. Again, this would be non-spiritual in nature, usually. But it is important to understand, okay, what's going on here, just factually. But then if it's biblical, certainly going back and reading the biblical examples would help a lot. And it's surprising how few art historians necessarily do that. But then I think that will help you unlock the Word of God, which is really what's going on here. And so then I think it's a question of meditating, maybe for a long time, on the painting.
Yeah.
Until you really start to see some of the richness and the depth, and some things you won't see. I mean, there's an El Greco at the Met, which is only on display now and then, called "The Curing of the Blind Man." Are you familiar with that painting? It's on display right now in the Lehman Gallery.
Okay.
It moves around the museums. Another thing that's difficult, but
Right.
Um, and, it's a painting that El Greco painted, I think, it was early in his career, but El Greco's a kind of, mystic painter.
Right.
Growing up in Crete, which, important to know, at the time in the mid-1500s, was a refuge for the Byzantine icon painters that had been thrown out of Constantinople after the fall to the Turks.
Right.
In 1462 or something. And yet it was controlled by the Venetians. So the Venetian Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance there. So, El Greco kind of grows up in this island gumbo. And one of his early works is this Curing of the Blind Man. And it's at the Met. And you see there Christ having this encounter with the blind man. And I always tell, our missionaries that our goal is to have an encounter with someone that we want to get their name, like, find out what's going on in their lives. Right? Jesus is having an encounter with this man, and there's this melee going on around him. To his right are all these Pharisees and other hoi polloi that have been demanding a sign, but are so busy with things of the world. They're pointing at things going on in traffic or trading rabbits or something or pigeons. And they kind of just completely miss the entire miracle. They're like, their backs are turned to Christ. The blind man's parents are witnessing what's going on, but you can see them becoming nervous. They're worried that this is going to pull them into some conflict with the Pharisees. So some people encounter Christ saying, like, what's this really going to cost me? Kind of thing, And others ignore him. And then, you got the apostles, Peter, trying to lend Christ an assist. He's holding his hand out. And then John, I always get people to see John because he's up above the other apostles. He's standing on a stool or something, but he's unshaven, non-bearded, he's young. But he's witnessing this encounter in a very special way, the gospel of love, right? Mm-hmm. And he sees, and of course, this story is in John. By the way, we know it's John because if you see the opening of the fifth seal, which is also at the Met occasionally, painted 40 years later, which is about John, it's the same face. So El Greco had this image of John for 40 years. But what's really interesting, Thomas, is if you go back and look at this painting or check it out in the pilgrimage, you'll see this dark shadow between Jesus and the Pharisees. And at first you won't even notice it. It's like one of these Rorschach tests almost. We didn't see it the first several times that we visited the painting. But John's actually looking at it. And if you read what our historians have to say about it, most of them say, well, it's unfinished work. This was probably going to be one of the helpers lifting the blind man up. And I'm thinking to myself, it goes back to like reading the gospel. There is no reference to a friend lifting him up. He's alone when Jesus encounters him. So it could be anyway. I mean, I'm not saying that's not possible, but if you look very carefully, what it really is, it's an evil spirit being driven out of the man. He's being exorcised by Jesus because, of course, that's what Jesus is actually doing. I mean, he's physically curing us, but more importantly, he's spiritually curing us, right? And
wow.
And El Greco understood that. And I think you do have to bring eyes of faith to a painting to really understand what is going on. And the real drama of the scene is completely different if this is just another magic trick versus, my goodness, we're witnessing an exorcism here.
Right. Yeah, we've been talking about understanding the kind of the content of a painting or the subject matter of a painting. there's also like the just appreciating the visual form of a painting. And for me, I'm not a super visual person. My background is music, and I was a little intimidated when first starting to go to museums, and I got over it just by exposure, you know. But one thing I found helpful with both visual art and poetry was to not feel like I have to do something with it, or like I have to get some specific thing out of it, or like I'm worrying about whether I'm understanding it properly, and just allowing myself to behold it, to really just look at it and let my eyes wander over it, or in the case of the poem, to read it out loud, being very helpful, and experience it in a sensory way, you know, and not just like, am I understanding what's behind this kind of thing. So, you know, it's good to have background knowledge and to look at things in their proper context, but also I think just to allow yourself to contemplate something without having to think about it too much. Ideally, those things go together, obviously, because the background knowledge informs without dominating your experience, I guess.
Yeah, and you know, I'd even recommend that's a whole different way of looking at a painting and can be really helpful. And you know, if you have time, it's almost worth doing both on different days, even. So going back, there's certain paintings in the pilgrimage that really almost encourage that kind of meditative assessment, not really assessment, just absorption by it. You know, there's a wonderful painting. They might have put it in storage briefly, I think, because they're redoing that Western painting section right now. But it's it'll be back by Raphael, called "The Madonna and Child," and it's painted during the High Renaissance. And Raphael paints it in a way that just pulls you in through that use of mathematical perspective. And I mean, I could go on about the intellectual aspects of this painting and also the spiritual ones, but I think for me, one of the great powers of that painting is sitting in front of it and just maybe praying or just listening what you're hearing from the word. That's about 4,000 years ahead of where you are right now. But, you know, the Max Rothko painting, they have a few, but there's one I'm thinking of in particular that's in the pilgrimage. And Rothko is actually seeking God in his own way. I mean, I think everyone's familiar with Rothko, with the colored squares that kind of vibrate. It's like an energy force. And that's another one that really invites you to just sit there and be pulled into the eternal somehow through that work.
And that's something you have to be open to, because some people might dismiss that, oh, it doesn't take any skill, or, you know, whatever. Okay, there's still something there. Does it take as much skill as, you know, Raphael? Maybe not in terms of technique, but there's still something there, I think, in his case in particular. I'm not going to justify every single artist and the quirky things that they do, but in his case, there is something there to contemplate. Maybe you're even just contemplating color more than the work of the artist per se, but that is itself a valuable thing, you know, to experience.
I mean, there's a whole chapter in the book called the end of the soul and the death of God, and that's followed by the shift into modern art. And you know, one of the problems for contemporary art today, I think, is that it's sort of like the same problem with our issue or challenge of our culture, is that once artists and the culture starts believing there is no God, it's a short leap to making ourselves God. And we become the creator. And, you know, it's really Picasso who makes that final dangerous leap in the Demoiselles d'Avignon, which is actually at the MoMA, which I'm sure you're familiar with that painting.
Yeah.
And that's where he invents Cubism, but Cubism itself but if you think of Cubism, what's going on there? I mean, Picasso is taking apart images that are created by God, and he's cutting them up and putting them back together, created by Picasso. And it's a short leap from that to Jackson Pollock and Max Rothko, where I think, I believe that all these artists are actually, talent is to find God, but that's their inner dilemma, right? I mean, they are seeking him, but now they don't even believe they're seeking him and are told he isn't there. And it gets a little bit crazy. And then it goes completely off the cliff, but a guy like Pollock, a lot of people would look at that and say, oh, the guy's nuts. I mean, anyone could do this, throwing paint around on a canvas. I think
it's a CIA operation. Is that
but
part too?
I think Pollock, in some ways became a mess because of his disbelief in God. And I think he's seeking, and I see in a Pollock a guy understanding the energy in nature. There's a painting at the Met called Autumn Rhythm, which is God, and seeing it, but denying it in some ways and saying, well, that's all there is. It's just chaos. And I like to contrast Autumn Rhythm by Pollock with the panel in the Sistine Ceiling, which most people would have seen, I think, and I have an image of it in the pilgrimage. God creating the universe. Mm-hmm. You've probably seen that panel.
Yeah.
And, in a way, it's similar, right? There's the sun up there and the swirl of energy in the universe. It's like the same swirl in Pollock's Autumn Rhythm, but the difference is in the Michelangelo, he's got it right. God is pulling the chaos into order. Mm-hmm. And in the Pollock, there is no God to pull the chaos into order, and there's just chaos. And, then you get drunk one night and drive your car with your mistress in it into a tree at age 42 and you're dead, Mm. And so it's sad. I mean, Rothko spent the last 7 years of his life designing a Catholic chapel, the Rothko Chapel in Texas.
We have to go in a minute, but if I can just ask really quickly, because we've been talking mostly about works that are religious works, except for just now. At the beginning of the book, you talk about the difference in ethos between Egyptian, Greek, and Roman art. And I was wondering if you could just quickly give your thoughts on that, because that's where I am right now. I finished Egypt. Now I'm in Greece and Rome. So what can we get out of those non-Catholic works and see from a spiritual perspective?
Yeah, I always tell my pilgrims that, if nothing else, from now forward, you don't need, textbooks a mile high in the science of this art if you just understand the spirituality of the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans, you completely understand their art, and you can walk into any museum in the world and instantly identify, oh, that's Greek. Oh, that's Roman. Oh, that's Egyptian. And let me tell you what the secret is. In Egyptian art, the ethos of Egyptian spirituality can be summed up as God as men. Right? So if you think about it, virtually all of their art is seeking the eternal in the afterlife. And their whole basic idea is, I can make myself into a god. I mean, we start off in the tomb of Perneb, where he's literally doing that. He has himself painted, seated, which in a Egyptian context is a divinity. Mm-hmm. Bigger than life, with all the little people bringing all his favorite things for his eternal party, which he's assuming is going to occur in this afterlife. So that's men as God. Then everyone laughs and go, well, I'm glad I wasn't an Egyptian. He ended up in the museum. Until I asked them, well, when was the last time you made yourself God? I mean, isn't that the sin of pride? In some ways, the original sin is is that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the Egyptians. But the Egyptians, at least in their art, are trying to find the eternal. That's why the art is two-dimensional. It's abstract. It's not meant to be here. It's there.
Mm-hmm.
The Greeks, the Greeks were different. I describe their theology, if you will, or their sense of spirituality as gods as men. So Greek spirituality is that the gods all come to earth as men and as women, in the case of Aphrodite as an example, but and that's why they're all perfect. So all of the Greek statues are here on earth. They're very much three-dimensional, but they're not portraits. They're actual idealized images,
Right.
perfect images that are, they're God. They're gods as men. And the best men are in fact gods. They deify the greatest athletes. They don't actually deify them. They say they must be gods, in a way, right? The Romans, if you think about it, were godless. I mean, yeah, they had all these, superstitions and things, but they only believed there was really the here and now. There's nothing after that. And if you look at their sculptures and art, because there's some wonderful Roman paintings as well at the Met, by the way.
Right. Yes.
You'll see that they're portraits of real people. And that gets kind of interesting because you see, have you gotten to Trebonius Gallus yet, Thomas?
I've seen it, yeah, and I read your book, so I saw that.
Book. Yeah,
yeah.
So
I'm fond of these Roman busts because they're flawed faces.
Yeah.
They're like these craggly looking Roman generals with their pockmarked faces and stuff. I love that actually. Yeah.
Yeah, and they, I give a lot of talks on the pilgrimage now, and one of my meditations is I call it the faces I wear. So if you go back to the Trebonius Gallus, you'll see that it's right next to the Constantine. So Trebonius Gallus is a godless guy. He gets to be emperor by killing the previous emperor. He lasts 4 years before he's executed by his own men. And you can see in that image this, pockmarked general, whatever, but more importantly, I think, the sense of concern and worry that he has, because it's all on him. And then you see the bust of Constantine right nearby. And he's got plenty of worries too. I mean, the empire is on the verge of breaking up, etc. He famously he lives his life as a Christian, is baptized at the end of his life, but he brings the empire into Christianity. Right. And he's a man of God. And you see in his face this look of serenity and confident joy that transcends the day-to-day worries of the world, Mm-hmm. And I always tell my pilgrims, every day is a choice when I leave the house in the morning. Am I going to have the face of Trebonius Gallus on or the face of Constantine? And I wish I'd tell you I always have the face of Constantine. I mean, on market days like we've had the last few days, sometimes I get the face of Trebonius Gallus. And I think it's it's a choice we have to make. It's a battle of wills, even, to throw ourselves into the Holy Spirit and let him guide us. It's interesting, you can go to, what's really interesting about this spirituality inside the sculptures, Thomas, is a lot of folks, they like to read the descriptions of the art that the Met leaves. And they'll try to catch me on something. Like, oh, this is actually a Roman sculpture. Like, actually, virtually all of the Greek sculptures in the Met are actually Roman. Right. So what it is when the Roman, nobles got rich, for a long time, the thing to do was to get a copy of a Greek statue. So they would have Roman artists copy the Greek statue. And what I find so fascinating is that these are artists very capable of doing Roman art. But when they're being paid to copy a Greek statue, they give us Greek art, which clearly has Greek spirituality, this sort of idealized sense of gods as men, God on earth. Mm-hmm. It's that element of God on earth, by the way, that, kind of attracted Paul. He thought he could convert them. You've been looking for God, right. Here he is. Famous speech in Athens. It didn't work out for Paul, but in that one particular instance, but
right.
Worked out broadly for Paul. But they used Roman artists. Most of the Greek art we have today, especially the stuff we have at the Met, is actually Roman copies of Greek originals.
Yeah. Well, Steve, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really enjoyed talking to you, and
thank you for having me, Thomas. I enjoyed the conversation with a fellow New Yorker.
Yeah, and for those listening again, the book is Pilgrimage to the Museum, Man's Search for God Through Art and Time. And get the book, but also go to your local museum and try to see what you can get out of it using a similar approach. And come to New York and go to the Met, sometime as well, because it's a great place. And don't miss the cloisters, because some people miss that because it's all the way uptown, but that's another great one as well.
You'll see people wandering around the Met with the book in their hands.
Yeah. You'll probably see some nuns there. It seems like every other time I go, there's some nuns or a group of priests or something. All right, Steve, thank you so much. And hope to see you, whatever your next book is. Yeah, well, we're still working on the aftermath of this one. It's been a blessing. It's been really doing well. And as you probably know, Thomas, all our royalties go to a seminary up in Cheshire. So the brothers are cheering us on with this project. Oh, great.
Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Mike Aquilina, Catholic Culture Audiobooks, bringing to life classic Catholic works through professional, high-quality audiobook recordings, and Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at catholicculture.org.